Listen, good to be back again, a week later. Last week, Mel, now hello, Mel. Mel, good to see you again.
Hi, Mel.
Terrific to have
Great
you
to be back.
It is good. And listen, last week, what you put up there, we put up 3 different videos, and you're really pulling together what's happening in Iraq, way over there in the East. And last week you said, and we both said, that we wanted people to look at what we're saying. We wanted people to look at what you're researching, what you're coming up with, not just to take it on board and to assimilate it and to memorize it and then to use it, but actually to work with it and understand it and see if there is any way that people can come back with us on it. This is like a white paper that we put out. The government puts out white papers as a testing to see how people respond to new policies. We did the same thing, you might say, and that's what we're doing with these set of videos. And we did get response, didn't we, Mel?
We did, yeah. There was, first of all, there was a great positive reaction to the overall thesis, which was good. And there was some pushback on certain areas, and there were some keen viewers who were pointing out where there was weaknesses in the thesis, where I didn't provide sufficient evidence. And that was really good because that forced me to go back and look for more evidence. And then there were a lot of viewers who offered suggestions for where I might be able to find more evidence. So it's been a really productive week since then. Found some great leads.
You took them seriously. You went back, you tried to find out. Some of them were giving you added material that you had not thought of before. Others were saying, here's a problem. And that's called peer review. And that's what we've asked for. We want this kind of peer review because we are putting out new material. This is the first time that you've all heard it. It's the first time for me for hearing some of this. Mel's the one who is really doing the research. I'm nothing more than you might say, a platform for him to get it out there so that we can engage with it. And you have engaged, and thank you for that. So what we want to do today, Mel has come back with some of your questions, some of your observations, and he is going to now really introduce some of these observations since last week. So this is brand new. What you're going to hear today is, again, new on top of what we already introduced in the last 3 episodes. So Mel, why don't you bring up your PowerPoint or go ahead and introduce it. And once you do that, I'll just keep talking until you're ready so that we can start looking and going with you on this.
Okay, let's see.
As he's bringing it up, you can see that we're talking about Iraq, and there is going to be in this discussion, what about Jordan? What about Petra? What about the farther to the west? We're going to go through and talk about both those categories. But let's go ahead. Over to you, Mel. Get us into this topic.
Okay, so first of all, thanks to all the viewers that sent me tips and suggestions. I was really surprised this week how much material came in from so many different parts of the world. I got suggestions from people in Tibet, India, the Middle East, France. So thank you to all of you.
Even Persia. I noticed some of yours are from Persia.
Yes, yeah, and some really nice confirmation of the thesis. And what's really interesting is people close to the ground of where we're talking about being able to confirm what I'm saying. So that was really reassuring. So the last time I suggested there was an Iraqi Persian origin, I received a number of confirmations since then. So first one, which was really interesting, was from Dr. Fred Donner. Now, considering I started from the groundwork up, so I looked at the data and then I produced a thesis just from the data, it was interesting to see a very highly respected scholar coming to a similar conclusion. So I'm just going to play you a short clip from a conference that Fred Donner was at, and this is him on the left-hand side.
And then we'll adjourn next door.
So where would you draw, please, the line between the historic Muhammad and the mythic Muhammad, as difficult as it may be? Evidently, there's a mythological aspect, Muhammad traveling through the skies and into the sky, and there's a historic aspect, clearly, but some people go as far as to say the religion of Islam, you mentioned it, didn't arise in the area of Mecca and Medina, rather in the area of Jerusalem.
Right.
So where would you draw the line?
Or South Arabia.
And
or South
Arabia. And again, how would you portray the political interests that led to the way the figure of Muhammad was construed over the decades, if not to say over the centuries?
You know, there are people who argue that Muhammad never existed. like there used to be people who argued that Jesus never existed because, we don't have actual documentary evidence for it. We only have the evidence from within the religious tradition. But the people who argue that, I think, are rather willful in overlooking a couple of pieces of evidence, not documentary exactly, but there is, for example, a scrap of Syriac text that dates from something like 634, which is only a couple of years after the prophet died, that talks about, in Syriac, the Tayyaye de Mehmet. It talks about the nomads of someone named, looks like Muhammad, right? So this is like almost immediately after he dies, there's a non-Muslim, shall we say, not from the believers community, a reference to an event involving a raid by these people, and they're associated with the name of a person named Mehmet. So I think we have to accept that, yeah, the prophet was there. Now, how much more of the, shall we say, mythic construction of Muhammad's life that we find in the traditional narratives, which as I summarized for you here earlier, we want to accept is a really tough question, and there's no answer that we can, no obvious answer we can give to it. My own sense, though, is that when, let's put it this way, when the day of judgment comes and all truths are revealed, including historic truths, if we get to that point, we will find, I think, that the traditional Muslim narrative is not completely off base, that maybe 80 or 90% of it is pretty much sort of what happened, but that there are certain points at which it has given a totally different spin to aspects of that development. And I think, for example, the notion of communal identity is one of those areas where the real picture might have been quite different from what we're given in the sort of traditional narration, the mythic picture.
Okay, so what we heard there clearly from Dr. Fred Donner is that he believes that Islam began both in Jerusalem and in southern Iraq, which confirms our thesis. And I presume when he talks about its beginning in Jerusalem, he's referring to things like the Dome of the Rock and so on. But it's interesting that he came to the same conclusion, probably following similar lines of evidence, but perhaps other pieces of evidence that I'm not privy to. So it's interesting that he came to that conclusion. Now, there's also the following, which I got from a viewer who mentioned Professor Gabriel Soma, who is an expert in both Aramaic and Arabic. And he also cites Iraq or Mesopotamia as being the place where the Quran was written. And so the context of this conversation is, what does the word asfar mean in Surah 62:5, which is highlighted?
62:5, so I've got it here in front of me. The likeness of those who were entrusted with the Torah, but who subsequently failed in those, is as the likeness of a donkey who carries huge burdens of books. And that's the word books that we're looking at. How bad is the example of people who deny the ayat of Allah, and Allah guides not the people who are the zalimun. So that's the verse that we're referring to in chapter 62, verse 5.
Yep. Now, so the key thing is that Professor Gabriel Soma points out that this word is a foreign word. It's an Aramaic word, and it means books, which is not the Arabic word. And so he explains that the particular words suggest that the Quran was written in Mesopotamia. Now, here's the video clip.
ممكن تقول لنا ما معنى سفر في
سفر نفس الكلمة سفر بالآرامي معناتها الكتاب. الكتب الخمسة لموسى النبي, the first 5 books, أسفار. جميع الكتب الموجودة.
كيف الجمع بتعملوه بالسرياني؟
سفري. واحد. صفر واحد سفري بتحط عليها أولاف وبتحط نقطتين. يعني بتضيف نقطة على الري بتصير سفري كتب.
فالسفر معناها كتاب.
معناتها كتاب.
وأسفار معناها كتب.
رايت.
فإذا هم عرفوا المعنى.
خليني أضيف شغلة كمان ذكرتني هلا. ونتيجة قناعتي بأنه القرآن كتب في ميسوبوتاميا
في بلاد الرافدين.
هو استعمال كلمات مثل أسفار أسفري. يعني بالسرياني الكتاب اكتبه، وبالجمع تبع أكتوبة بنقول أكتوبة، يعني أسفار، أسفوري.
فإذا
يعني
هذا الجمع، هذا الجمع يستعمل في هذه
حتى
المنطقة
باللغة السريانية. هلا في كثير ناس من الذين يدرسون اللغة الأرامية يعتبرون أنه في كلمات عربية أدخلت على اللغة العربية، ولكن مصدر هالكلمات هي أرامية. مثلا التعريف ما بحياتها كانت عربية. إذا بتقرأ العهد القديم بتلاقي التعريف مكتوبة بالعهد القديم 2000 سنة قبل مجيء الإسلام.
So essentially, and the key part that Professor Solmas says is, I would like to add something now. You remind me of something, and because of my conviction that the Quran was written in Mesopotamia. So there you have it. He believes that based on the vocabulary found in the Quran, it's not only that the fact that they are using Aramaic, but he's pointing out that the particular Aramaic that's been used is typical of Mesopotamia. And it's connected with the way that the words are pluralized in that language, which is a form of grammar that was inherited in the Quran and used in Arabic. So in other words, the Quran has borrowed a grammatical style in its use of Arabic. So it's a key connection. Now, I'm not a linguist, and obviously this would be an area for further research, but it would have to be done by a linguist. But I'm pointing out that there is additional evidence beyond what I've stated before, which would suggest an Iraqi connection to the beginnings of Islam. Okay.
So both what Rashid has come up with and what Donor has come with are both pointing to the fact that this is for the southern Iraq, the Mesopotamian area, and these are nothing more than keys that are pointing to that direction.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, I also got the following interesting message from one of our viewers, and it was to do with the idea of the Tashi, which was mentioned in a Chinese report from the 8th century. Now, he points out the following, that in his local languages, the Y sound is often translated into a Z sound, which could easily be taken as an S or SH sound. So I'm just going to read from him. He says, the suggestion that Chinese term for Arab, Tashi, may be related to Taiyaye makes sense to me. In our town, people dominantly speak two languages that are closely related. Except for a few cases, in most of the words wherever Y sounds occur in one language, in the other one, its corresponding words have Z sound. Example, the word for mad is yiyar in one language, and in the other it is zuzar. Likewise, there are many words like that. Interestingly, even in case of borrowed words, we see the pattern. For example, the word for betel nut is koye in one language, which is the right sound of the loan word, whereas in the other language, it turns to kozu. The languages spoken in our town belongs to Sino-Tibetan family and therefore has some bearing on the sound change pattern even in Chinese. This pattern of sound change from Y to Z is very regular, after which changing from Z to S or SH sound is very easy to make. In fact, I once thought of some words that interchange Y to S sound within the two languages spoken in our town, but I cannot remember those words now. But such cases exist. All I wanted to say is your inference of a relationship between Taiyaye and Tashi makes sense. Thank you so much to Mel and Jay. Overall, a very informative discussion. So that was quite an interesting lead, which confirms my hunch that perhaps the word Tashi in the Chinese chronicle is in relation to Taiyaye. Now, I don't know if it was the same viewer, but another Chinese viewer gave me the following lead, which was another Chinese source, which also backed up the claim, and there was lots of nuggets of gold in this one. There are some mythical elements which we can disregard, but the core historical elements are very interesting. So he says that your theory is very similar to the story mentioned in the Chinese official historical sources of Ju Tang Su, the old book of Tan, compiled in 945 AD. Ju Tan Su, volume 198, biographies 148, Western regions, section Dashi. Dashi, Middle Chinese Daizik, situates in the west of Persia. So that would correspond to the Taiyaye in Mesopotamia. During the year of Daye, 605 to 618 of Su dynasty, there was a Persian man herding camels in the mountains, Jufen Modina. One day, a lion man appeared out of nowhere telling him there are 3 caves on the west side of Jufen Modina mountain. A large amount of weapons is stored inside the caves and you can go and retrieve them. There is also a black stone with text carved on it. You will become the king if you read and do what the carved text on the black stone tells you. The Persian then followed the lion man's words and did find a large amount of weapons and the black stone with carved text telling him how to raise an army and rebel, I think it means against the Persian Sassanid dynasty. The Persian then recruited fugitives and then crossed the river Hingji to raid the caravans on the trade route. He then claimed himself to be the king and set up a separatist regime in the western part of Sassanid empires. The newly founded kingdom, separatist regime, then, I think that's meant to be, rebelled and defeated numerous subsequent Persian and Fulin, East Roman Empire invasion forces. In the second year of Yang Hu, the Dashi sent its first envoy with tributes to our Tang royal court. The envoys told us that their king's surname was Dashi, with Kangmi Mo Ni, and as the given name. They told us that their nation had been founded for 34 years since 617 with 3 kings. So this would suggest an early source, despite the fact that it was compiled in 945. It seems to be that the envoy who was sent to China 34 years after 617, which I haven't added up, but I think it might be 651. This is an early record. Now, the only thing that's mysterious really is the fact that there's a reference to a lion man, which I haven't been able to figure out. I do know that an uncle of Muhammad in the Hadiths is referred to as the Lion of Allah. Now, I don't know if that's related to this part of the story, but what's interesting is that it's a Persian man that's involved in this conflict with the Persians, which confirms some of the clues that we got in our 2 earlier videos, which suggests that this guy Muhammad might have had a Persian connection. So the Chinese are convinced that this guy wasn't an Arab after all, but a Persian. The other interesting thing is it suggests that after the initial conflict with the Persians, he heads off to the west. Now, this is interesting because this might tie in with Dan Gibson's idea of Petra. So that it could be that this Persian, after coming up into conflict with the Persians, retreated to a fortress way off in the west, Petra being the ideal location, regrouped, and then continued the rebellion from there. So that's where perhaps the 2 theories might coalesce, if you like.
Well, let me just jump in here real quickly. This is interesting because you're bringing up a source material that has nothing to do with Arab, Persian, or Jordanian roots or Nabatean. So you're bringing up something that's far, 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 far to the east. It's way off, thousands of miles away. Therefore, there would be no reason, or there'd be no impetus, or there'd be no, you might say, well, maybe not the word impetus, but there would be no control of what they're saying. So it's completely neutral. It's because it's so far away, there'd be no reason for them to want to write what they have been told. And what's fascinating is they are referring to this Persian character, putting it much further northeast. But what you're saying is that this time period also fits, because if it's 34 years after 617, around 651, this would be the same time period we're looking at as well. And if it does mean that it's moving from Iraq over to Jordan, that would fit into with Dan Gibson's material.
Yeah, and the other little detail that's quite interesting is we we see a reference to the black stone with carved text on it. So this might be the origin of that. Now, whether that's a mythological element or it's refers to something that was there and it was part of their belief system in those early days is hard to say. But it's interesting that the black stone is mentioned. But notice it has carved text on it. So
stop and think, though, Mel. Remember, the black stone is Nabatean. It always has been Nabatean since the 2nd century AD. There's a precedence for the black stone. The black stone always was, according to tradition, has always been in Petra. If this is the same black stone, that black stone was one stone, and it did have writing on it. Since then, it has been broken up now into small pieces. So the black stone today is just small pebbles that have been put into tar. Obviously, there has been damage done to it. But if this is, and it's saying the black or a black stone, which is suggesting that the people who are listening to this would know about this stone. It assumes that there's already knowledge of it. That would make sense then if this is a pre-existing stone that has come from a nascent environment. In this case, I would say Nabatean environment. Again, farther to the west.
Yep. So this nicely ties up the two theories. So essentially, the early part of Muhammad's story would happen in Iraq, and then the later part would happen way off in the west. And so, if we take in the chronicle from, I think it's 640.
Well,
so, if we refer to the chronicle of Thomas the Presbyter, he refers to the Tayyeh of Muhammad in the year 634, involved in a battle east of Gaza. So this would tie in with Muhammad being further west, such as Petra. So Gaza would be a natural point for him to do an excursion from Petra.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a reference from Thomas the Presbyter to a battle waged by the Tayyeh of Muhammad in 634. Now that would fit in nicely with Petra because that would be northwest of Petra. And we can imagine that if Muhammad had gathered his troops around the Petra area, the natural place that he would lead to would be up to the northwest and continue along the coast and into various parts of Palestine and on from there. So that kind of makes sense. So I'll send that one. Okay, so now another point that I would like to refer to here is in the Chinese Chronicle refers to Ju Fen Modina. And that first part, Ju Fen, raised a few eyebrows for me. I was wondering what word are they referring to? Because obviously they've translated how it sounds to a Chinese ear. Now the Modina part is kind of obvious, that would be Medina. But I found the following, according to Yakut, quoting Hamza, the original form was Tusfun or Tusfun, which was Arabized as Tesafun or Tesafan. So I think Yufen is probably an attempt at rendering Tusfun into Chinese now. Perhaps our Chinese viewers will come back to us and confirm or deny that this might be the case. But
and it could be very simple.
So essentially,
the city of Tasfan or the city of Stesafan, because Medina would mean the word for city.
Yeah.
So it's just saying the city of Stesafan.
Exactly. Yeah. So that would suggest that we have the original Medina where Muhammad starts off, which is Ctesiphon, and then he's heading west to Petra. So we have both theories signified by this Chinese source. So that was an excellent source and quite a useful guide to our researches. Now, there's also the following. In the following Chinese source, there is indicated a change in the Islamic narrative, which was noted by the Chinese at the time. The Dachi continues sending diplomatic envoys and paying tributes to Tang China 3 more times after 651 AD. They are between the years of Chang'an, in the 2nd year of Jin Yun, and during the years of Kai Yun, which the last one being 613 to 741. The Tang royal court officials noticed that the diplomatic envoys of Dashi wouldn't kneel down in front of the emperor and kept insisting they only kneel in front of the god they worshipped. They finally succumbed and kneeled in front of the emperors because of the threat of expulsion out of Tang royal court by the royal officials. And here is the bit that's interesting. However, the Tang government noticed a change of regime within Dashi, or a revolt taking place, while receiving Dashi envoys during the years of Zide, which is 756 AD to 758. The reason is that the envoys told the Tang royal court officials a nearly completely different version of stories about the founding of Dashi. This time the name Muhammad appears and the storyline is very similar to the Islamic traditions. The Tang Chinese officials were very confused and thus recorded both versions of stories in the Ju Tang Shu. So what we have here is that the key period 756, 758, we see the first appearance of the new version of events. And this would correspond to the advent of the Abbasid regime. So it's essentially a smoking gun that indicates that we're not just imagining a change of Islamic narrative. Even the Chinese way back in the 8th century spotted this and were puzzled by it and recorded both stories in their records.
Fascinating, because what you're bringing up, Mel, is you're bringing a neutral reference point thousands of miles away, and look at the dates, 756 to 758. If this happens around 749 to 750, you're talking about 6 to 8 years later. They then see the repercussions of this there as far away as China, which would be about the time period it would take them to actually start sending envoys and start actually making an impact on they would see the impact from their perspective, seeing the way that they the new officials treat them versus the ones that were prior to them. Fascinating, because that would fit the right time period as well, being that far away.
As we know from so many things that we've looked at before, the Abbasids were keen to wipe from the history books all traces of the Umayyads, and one way of doing that was to create a completely fresh narrative which would justify their own claims to power by suggesting that they were related to Muhammad, so therefore they were the entitled successors to Muhammad. But what a lot of Muslims today don't seem to realize is that the Abbasids were Persian. So if they are claiming family ties to Muhammad, this is quite embarrassing stuff, because it undermines the idea that Muhammad was an Arab. But
can I also
the idea,
taking one step further from that, is it's not also then help us understand why is it that none of the earlier material would be in the traditions? Because remember that the traditions only begin to appear after this. The traditions only begin to appear with Ibn Ishaq in 765, Ibn Hisham in 833, Al-Waqidi in 835, Al-Bukhari 870. That's another 100 years after this. That would then make sense why, if already the Chinese are seeing that they're eradicating any reference to the earlier regime, the hated regime, then why are we surprised that the same thing would not exist also in the traditions, which then all follows subsequent to this time?
Absolutely. And, it seems very likely to me that someone must have written down an earlier biography of Muhammad, whoever he was. Let's call him Iyas, as I suggested in an earlier video. But whatever biography they would have had, they got rid of it, along with so many different sources. And that's one of the reasons why there's this massive 150 to 200 year gap in the history. Even those sort of gaps
tell us that. Even the traditions tell us that. I mean, the story behind Al-Bukhari is that he was given 600,000 of these traditions, and he was to then choose which were authentic and which were not, and he whittled them down to 7,300. So I think it's 97, something like that. So just say 7,400. Now, in other words, he only retains 2%. The other 80% he throws out. Well, we can see if this is happening in the Chinese courts a century earlier, it stands to reason then Al-Bukhari had an agenda here, and his agenda is to eradicate anything that did not fit with their narrative, and their narrative would be very much a Persian, an Abbasid, a post 750 narrative. And of course, Muhammad would be part of that narrative.
Absolutely. So we have the following. Note the tribe of Muhammad has been redacted from the Tayyaye to Quraysh here. Another saying is that the ruling clan of Dashi tribe is called Guli, which the note down below says it's Quraysh according to modern scholars. During the year of Kai Huan, 581 to 600 AD of Su dynasty, there are two families within the Guli tribe. One family is called Pen Ni Zi Shen, and the other one is called Pen Ni Mo Huan, which are the Banu Hashim and the Banu Makhzum. There was a man from Pen Ni Zi Shen called Mo Ki Mo, who was very brave and wise and was hailed as the king by the tribe people. The king Mo Ki Mo then expanded the kingdom's territory, stretching across 3,000 leagues from east to west with his mighty forces. He also conquered the city of Jiala, which is also called City Shan. So down below you can see the various suggestions for who each of these names are. Mo Ki Mo is the Chinese rendering of Muhammad, according to modern scholars.
Fascinating.
So yeah, so we can see there's here with this reference, we can see the transition from Tayyaye to Quraysh. Now the Quraysh being a more Persian tribe because of its connection with Cyrus, as I mentioned before, whereas Tayyaye is more clearly an Arabian tribe. Now, why would the Abbasids want to push aside the Tayyaye reference and push forward the Quraysh connection? Because they're clearly vowing for power and they want to push their agenda. And that's why we see the references to Tayyaye disappearing from the Islamic tradition. And if you want to find those references, you have to go outside the Islamic tradition to find them. And, you know, if you look at the 7th century, wherever there's references to Muhammad, you invariably see references to the Tayyaye, but that disappears in the Islamic tradition. So there is manipulation going on with the data in the Islamic tradition for political purposes. So that's the key thing I would point out.
So
Now,
there's censorship going on that early, that it makes sense then. If that all you have is that later tradition, all that has been censored, all that has been thrown out a good 100 years earlier, then all that we have is the much later rendition. No wonder everybody's getting it wrong for so many of the time. I like what you're saying here, that you need to therefore look at the neighbors that are still there, who they didn't have control over, like the Chinese. They wouldn't have had control to eradicate and censor their material. They probably are giving us a better eye as to what is actually going on.
I'm conscious of the irony that it's the Chinese that are giving us the uncensored version, considering they're not exactly known for uncensored material nowadays. So there's a great irony there.
Century, but certainly in the 8th and 9th century, they were, yeah.
Yeah. So the dashi, I would suggest, is how the Tayyaye is rendered, and you can have a look there for yourselves. That's just a reference to that to back up that point. Now, I also got this interesting lead from Salam Fuad, an Arabic speaker. He mentioned that there was a book by Yassin al-Mazri called Islam Came from Persia, which was a bit of an eye-opener to discover this. I don't know anything about the book. I only have this lead, and Murad, who's on our team, plans to read this book and see what this author has got to say. But he clearly is on a similar track as me. And he wrote this book about 2 years ago. So I wasn't aware of this book because it was written in Arabic. But anyway, the main details is that Iyas or Ilyas or Muhammad was born of a Persian father and an Arab mother. So that might explain the ambiguity about what his ethnicity was. He says that his mother was from an Arab tribe called Al-Manatira, which would be a Lakhmid tribe. Muhammad led this Arab tribe in a battle against the Persians called Dikar or Thikar. The Persians were defeated in this battle. After that battle, Muhammad became the enemy of the Persians and wanted to kill him. So he escaped to Petra. And the rest of the story exists in a book entitled Islam Came from Persia. The book is written in the Arabic language by Yassin al-Mazri. This book can be downloaded and so on. So if any of you want to read that. But according to this book, there are 3 key places, he says: Maru and Khorasan, which is in the eastern part of Iran, and into Afghanistan, Iraq, and Petra in Jordan. So that's what he reckons. So it's interesting that this author is coming to a combination of both Dan Gibson's theory and mine. And this is totally unconnected with me. I wasn't aware of it. So interesting. The only thing I would probably challenge about his theory is his suggestion that Muhammad was connected to a Lakhmid tribe. I think that might be a bit of poetic license in his story. I think it's more likely that it was Tayayi based on the early sources. But disregarding that, I think some of the other details are interesting and worth pursuing further. Now, onto another little detail. One of the suggestions that I made in one of the videos was the idea that there was a link between Jewish Babylonian incantations and the Quran. And there was a bit of pushback among some viewers with my suggestion that the Quran might include incantations. And lo and behold, quite by accident, I found the following in the Hadith. Yahya related to me, and notice that Yahya is a Mandaic name, related to me from Malik, from Yahya ibn Sa'id, from Amra bint Abdul ar-Rahman, that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq visited Aisha while she had a health complaint, and a Jewish woman was making incantation or ruqya for her. Is that how you pronounce it? Ruqya or ruqya? Ruqya. I'll just say that again. We'll start from the top. I'll start from the top. Yahya related to me from Malik, from Yahya ibn Sa'id, from Amra bint Abdul ar-Rahman, that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq.
Maybe I should read it.
Do you want to? Yeah, please.
Yahya related to me from Malik, from Yahya ibn Sa'id, from Amra bint Abd al-Rahman, that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq visited Aisha while she had a health complaint, and a Jewish woman was making incantation, ruqya, for her. Abu Bakr said, do it, the incantation, with the book of Allah.
So that's interesting. So there you have a confirmation that the Quran was used for incantations. So they use them for a Babylonian style spell, which was a very common tradition that goes way back thousands of years. And you find that in southeastern Iraq. So it's an interesting corroboration to the idea that these stories emerged from southern Iraq. Okay. Now, in relation to the Quraysh Iraq link, I got some interesting leads. The first one comes from a Jewish contact. He gave me this tantalizing lead, which we will try to follow up with a written record. He says that the Bani Quraysh refers to Persian nobles who claim descent from the Achaemenids. In reality, only one branch of the Achaemenids could be called Bani Quraysh. I don't think I've ever heard it spoken outside of our community's religious context, where I have heard it used as a friendly way of referring to Kurds, because Kurds and Israelis get along very well and have a lot of solidarity. The problem is that so many religious books from our community were burned by people like the Nazis, etc. So what's interesting here is this Jewish contact has heard the Bani Quraysh being used in the context of people from Persia. So I think we're on good ground there with that. But obviously, he's going to find any written records from history to see if there's a record of that to strengthen our case. We also got the following from someone who emailed you. This is anecdotal evidence from the Persian side. Hi Jay, just watched yours and Mel's video. He could be right about the Quraysh. Do you know why? If in those days they used to refer to the Persians and the Persian side of the region as Bani Quraysh, the children of sons of Quraysh, that absolutely makes sense, because Cyrus the Great is called Quraysh in the Middle East. Even today, we Persians proudly say that we are children of Cyrus or Quraysh. So that was quite a nice confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I also got the following link. And this one is sort of a dead end, but I thought it's a curious one, and I thought I would include it just for the sake of completion, and maybe others might disagree with my idea that it's a sort of a dead end. It's not conclusive. But in any case, in 1914, Alphonse Mingana, together with Agnes Smith Lewis, co-wrote a book about some early Quran manuscripts.
Can we stop there just a minute?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
Both of these two slides that you just put together, not many people will know, because they will not be aware of why we're zeroing in on the Quraysh. Let me just jump in real quickly and explain that.
Yeah.
Let me do that real quickly. Just for those of you who are not aware of what we're talking about, it's the Quraysh. The reason we're zeroing in on the Qurayshi is because of the reference to the Qurayshi dialect and the Qurayshi, the original Quran that Uthman wanted to have written, Zayd ibn Thabit, to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. And this has come up over and over again, that this dialect is unique to Medina and Mecca, or the Hijaz, the central part of Arabia. And what's great, Mel, what you're doing here, and I think it's terrific, as you're saying, no, wait a minute, let's look at this word Qurayshi again. This Qurayshi is a word, but what we're realizing, this Qurayshi is actually, the best reference to it is the word for Cyrus, which would be Persian. So it's not the Hijaz, it's not Mecca, it's not Medina. We're actually talking about much further northeast. And that's why you're tying this in by saying even the words give a little bit of a tag as to where this is taking place. And again, it pulls it back away from the south and puts it up into the northeast. Well done. Thank you for that.
Cheers. So in 1914, Alphonse Mingana, together with Agnes Smith Lewis, co-wrote a book about some early Quran manuscripts. They cite a homily by a 5th century Christian scholar called as evidence that the Quraysh were mixed up in Syrian affairs long before Muhammad. So this is way back 1914. Mingana is suggesting that the Quraysh are way up there in Iraq, which is interesting. This is over 100 years ago. Now, the evidence that he provides is, as I say, it's inconclusive, but I'm going to share it with the audience and they can make their own mind up. So in relation to the person who wrote the homily, Narseh died around the year 500. He taught exegesis, or biblical interpretation, at the school of Edessa and then the school of Nisibis. He wrote extensively, and many of his homilies have survived. One of these is called On the Evil of the Age. In 488, the Arabians rebelled and launched a series of raids in Iraq, taking slaves and booty. According to Narseh, the raids in Iraq led people to curse the sons of Hagar, the Ishmaelites, and to wish that Abraham had never touched Hagar. He refers to two groups whose violence had wounded the region, the Kadeshis and the Tamaris. The Tamaris are referred to as being Iranian in another source, but it doesn't say where these were from, the Kadeshis. Now, so we have the following in Syriac, and in English, as you can see, it says, "Are the Kadeshis brothers with the sons of Hagar? They looted the world more thoroughly than the Ishmaelites. Does the lineage of the Tamuris run from Abraham? They made Assur, mother of kings, like a wasteland." So the problem with this is what you're seeing there is Kadeshi, there isn't Qurayshi. So it doesn't seem very much use as a tie. Again, in another part it says, "Let us not then blame fathers and sons, but the inclination that divides these two things, good and evil. Let us blame the evil inclination of the sons of Hagar, and especially the beastly people of Kadesh." Now, as I say, it's not slam dunk, but it is an interesting possibility. Mingana and Lewis see a graphical error in the text and corrected Kadesh to Quraysh. So Kadesh is now read as Quraysh and Kadeshi as Qureshi. Graphically, the change is very small indeed. In Syriac, the difference between the D and the R is simply a dot. So if you take the dot below that little squiggle, place it above the line, you have Quraysh. Now, I don't know how you feel about that. It's possible, I think, but I don't think it's strong enough case. And I would like to see examples of it used correctly before I'd be won over by this argument.
But you're still suggesting that if this is true, then we're still talking about the Qurayshi, the same people. These are the Persians. Those are the lineage of Cyrus. So therefore, it would still be northeast, is what you're implying.
Yeah, yeah. I think the fact that he believed that the Quraysh were way up in Iraq. If you think about how far scholarship has gone in the past 100 years, that he was even making that suggestion, it seems it would have seemed preposterous, considering that 100 years ago, most people considered the Islamic tradition was basically correct, that everything happened in the Hijaz. So for someone to make that leap to it being up in Iraq is quite incredible.
Except it was about this time at the beginning of the 20th century where there started to be doubts coming out of the German school that the Islamic traditions may be in error. And not that they may be in error as to what they're saying, they may be in error as to because they're written so late. And so you can see why this would make sense if the historical evidence that's coming from that time period that has nothing to do with the traditions, is not controlled by the traditions. If it's saying using the same words, then that would make sense. In this case,
Yeah.
you're right. It's just a dot above or below the letter. A dot can easily be misplaced. And if that is the case, could this be the Qurayshi? I would see no difficulty with that. It would be the same argument that we're having with Becca versus Mecca in Quran as well.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also a possibility that perhaps locally the name might have been used alternatively as Kadesh as well as Koresh. That might be the case, but it seems very similar, certainly.
Yeah. Okay.
So the other one that I was given as a reference, and it's sort of inconclusive. It was an engraving on a spa, and it's labeled JA931, Hadramut, Yemen. It dates back to the 3rd century CE, 270 AD.
Is the Hadramaut, which is the southern part of Yemen, what is today Yemen and Oman today, that southern area, which was highly civilized at that period, and this would be where many of the inscriptions would have come from.
Yeah. Among the congratulatory delegations was a delegation of Destroy, which is Syria, a delegation from the Chaldeans in Iraq, a delegation from India, and a reference to a delegation of Arab women from Quraysh. Now, the person who sent this to me as a possible connection with Iraq suggested that this is an Iraqi connection. Now, personally, I don't see where the connection is with Iraq. It might be that they're assuming it's Iraq because of number 2 and the fact that these were all foreign delegations. But there's nothing, just looking at it objectively, there's nothing in this text to convince me that the Quraysh were from Iraq. If I was just being fair and honest, unless there's something else in this inscription that I didn't find, and perhaps if any of our viewers are aware of more information from this inscription, maybe there is something extra that I've missed, but I don't see any connection.
Could it be nothing more than the fact that they're listing 1, 2, 3, 4 different delegations? 3 of them are known places: Syria, Iraq, and India. Quraysh is the only one we're in doubt. It's obvious that if this was, well, not obvious, but if this was the Quraysh, as we've been saying all along, the Quraysh, which is Syria, that would be Persia. So that would be Syria, Iraq, and Persia, along with India. So those would be 4 well-known places, because obviously, whoever wrote this inscription, if it is in 270 AD, they assumed that people would know where these places were at that time.
Yeah. That would be the logical thing, that it's not so far away that they wouldn't that they would require to put the country of Quraysh next to it. Perhaps it was really
and the fact
obvious.
That we don't have anything from that far south at all in inscriptions that early suggests to me that this was a well-known place, or these people are well-known people. Otherwise, why would you put an inscription if they're nothing more than fictional?
Yeah. So it's So I think at least it confirms that there is a group called the Quraysh. It wasn't an inscription I was aware of until this week, so that's quite interesting. And if we draw in all the other evidence, perhaps that this group was actually a Persian group, as some people have suggested. So just going on from there, then, I was asked to justify Sabius's early authorship in the 660s. Now, there was one particular viewer who writes under a Greek name who gave me quite a lot of challenging comments, and One of them that I've particularly thought was worth coming back on was in relation to Sebius and his early authorship, and he believed that he was actually a later author than I'm suggesting. But
He puts it into the
the
8th
reason,
century, doesn't he? He puts Sabaeus into the 8th century.
yeah. So I kind of follow Robert Hoyland's lead on this, because Robert Hoyland is the expert on the early sources. He was the person who gathered all of these sources together in one book. And he was the person that actually championed the criteria that most scholars use nowadays in terms of querying the sources, checking for things like bias, checking for dates, authorship, and so on. So he was the expert that set down the criteria, and you find that in his book, Seeing Islam as Others See It. So here's some quotations from him. Well, starting with a non-quotation, I should maybe. Robert Hoyland considers the authorship of Sebius in question, i.e. it is anonymous, but on dating and reliability, he's much more positive. So one quote from him is that there are indications that Sebius lived through many of the events that he relates. He maintains that the account of the Arab conquest derives from fugitives who had been witnesses thereof, and speaking of happenings in 652, declares that the Armenian faith has prevailed until now. Now, considering his history ends in the year 661, that would indicate that he's writing around that time frame. He also says that as for Sebius's trustworthiness as a chronicler, one should note his occasional use of documentary material. This consists of an exchange of letters between the Armenian Patriarch Zumatas, 615 to 628, and the Deputy Patriarch of Jerusalem, Modestus, 614 to 631, and extracts from a declaration of faith composed in 648. So, in other words, Sebius, relatively speaking, is a good historian. He's using evidence, particularly documentary evidence. He's using eyewitnesses, which would lead us to have confidence that he was an early writer and also that he was a reliable writer. He goes on to say, our confidence in Sebius is further increased by his apparent access to certain privileged information. An example is the Persian sack of Jerusalem in 614, for which he is the only writer to explain why the Persians, who seem to have inflicted little or no damage on towns and cities in Syria and Palestine, ravaged Jerusalem, namely that initially a truce had been arranged, but a few months later some youths of the city killed the Persian governors stationed there, and a riot broke out between Jews and Christians, which necessitated Persian intervention. So essentially Robert Hoyland would say that based on evidence like this, we could consider him to be a reliable author on these events. Now, he also includes some less positive elements about Sebius. Sebius is not, however, immune from error. In particular, he conflates the two Persian assaults of 615 and 626 into a single incident, which results in his leapfrogging or misplacing the events of 616 to 625. But he says, despite these and a few other shortcomings, the novel and often accurate information in Sebius means that he must be taken seriously. So on that basis, I think Sebius is a really good source to use. He's an early source. In some cases, he's unreliable, but in the majority of cases, he seems to be using eyewitnesses and documentary evidence. So I think as long as we use him in addition to other sources, I think we're on fairly safe ground. If viewers have any suggestions for what lineman might refer to, would love to hear from you, particularly our Chinese viewers, and I pass it back to you, Jay. Thank you.
Well, yes, Mel, this is great, and I love what you're doing here because you're actually taking people seriously, and you're saying, listen, I'm putting this out there. These are suppositions. I'm willing to be tested. I'm willing to be critiqued. I'm willing to even to respond to those criticisms, and you've done that just here, and this has been excellent. As you walk through, and you've not only referred to the questions that people are bringing up, you're also referring to the suggestions and showing how the suggestions actually support and give more meat to what you're finding out. So let me just go through a quick review of what I come up with. I've been taking notes as you've been talking. I love the fact that you started with Fred Donor. Dr. Fred Donor is a heavyweight in Middle Eastern history. He's a good one to begin with, and it's great that you have him up there suggesting that much of this that we find in Islam is from the southern Iraq, further east and further north. He doesn't give support as to why he's come from that conclusion, but you're going to go through and say, now, probably because of what we have been finding. You zero in on, and as support for this, you started with Surah 62, verse 5, and the word asfar, which is an Aramaic word for the word kitab, which is the Arabic word equivalent. What is that doing in the Quran? Unless, of course, that verse was derived from the Aramaic antecedents. That would suggest then the Quran is also from much further north, because I think you said in the last one we did a week ago, you said that 70% of all the foreign words in the Quran are Aramaic. With such an overwhelming number of the foreign words Aramaic, that would already place it much further north and much further east, the Quran itself. I love the fact that you keep coming back to Daiya. And you go to the Chinese, and this is great because by using the Chinese, Mel, what you're doing is you're stepping outside of the tradition, you're stepping outside of that environment, you're stepping outside of that period and saying, listen, much of the material that's from that period has been destroyed. We know that. We know it's been destroyed because all the material that we do get from the 9th and 10th century is so late, they destroyed everything that goes before that, and you do bring that up about halfway through your talk. If that is the case, then we would not find material from that part of the world that early that would give us the real picture. So let's go outside and let's go to people who had contact with them. Let's go as far as China, thousands of miles away. There's no way that the Arabs or anybody else could have any control over them. And let's see what they say, because they've had contact with these people, these Daiya, and they use the word Tashi. Daiya, Tashi, that's their, and when you ever do that, and any of us who do foreign languages, you hear it and you write it as you hear it in your own alphabet, using your own your own alphabet, your own way of writing. So the way they heard the word Daiya, they heard it as Tashi. You then go and you say this can be supported because of the difference between Y and S. Now we know this. Listen, most of the people from the Far East, and I'm not stepping on any toes by saying this, to ask, when I lived in Japan for 2 years, ask the Japanese to tell you the difference between rice and lice. In fact, most Japanese who listen to me right now don't think there's any difference, but you can see there's a difference between rice and lice, and you better make sure you get the right difference, otherwise you're going to be eating lice for lunch. See, that's the difficulty. When you go into foreign languages, you mispronounce it. So a Y could easily be an S, could also be a SH from their hearing point, not from the way we say it, because we hear it pretty well, we think. But then there are things that they say, listen, I have a daughter-in-law who's Chinese, and when I listen to her speak Mandarin, she has 9 different tones. I don't pick up any of them. Look, to me, she's just singing, but she picks up every one of them. So you are acutely aware of your own language pronunciation and also tonation in the same way that they would be hearing these Arab words or these Aramaic words, they would write it differently. And that's exactly what you brought up by giving the example. That's why do not be surprised if it's written sometimes Y, sometimes even D, and sometimes even S or SH. And that's what you find out. And when you get to, I love what you did with Jiu Tang Chu in 945, this is the 10th century. He writes the word Jufen Modina. Jufen, well, that could be teaspoon. Jufen could be teaspoon. What is again, listening to it, what are they talking about? Well, it's Ctesiphon. That's the way they hear the word Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon is what is today Baghdad. That's exactly what we're talking about. And Modena could very well be Medina, which is the city of Ctesiphon. Fascinating, because I remember when I was in Japan, the first time I went to McDonald's, and I said, where can I find a McDonald's? They said, what? I said, McDonald's. Oh, Makodonalido. In Japan, McDonald's is Makodonalido. And there's even a song to it, Makodonalido. That's how they say McDonald's. But they hear Ctesiphon is Jufen or teaspoon. And Modena would be Medina. So then suddenly we realize they're talking about, again, where's Ctesiphon? That is in Iraq. That's where Baghdad.
Well, actually, just across the river in Persia, actually, just inside the Persian border.
Absolutely. Thanks. And but you see, this is not Mecca. This is not Medina. This is not the Medina of today or the Yathrib of yesterday, because remember, Medina means city. It's Yathrib that we're talking about from that time period. It would have been that name. Then fascinating, you then go into this this reference about 756 to 758, where these Chinese are getting these delegates that are coming from again the Persian delegates. They're very clear that they're Persian, but that something happens between 756 to 758. That's the 8th century, mid 8th century, and they have a completely different change of regime, and they start sublimating. They don't want us to know that anything that's happened from the previous regime, which is quite political. That happens all the time. You can pretty much be sure that even happens today. When a new government comes to power, they want everything eradicated from the previous government, or you don't even mention it. So this is the situation that's happening in the 8th century. And it looks like what you're saying, Mel, is this could be the change between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. The Abbasids, again, who have their headquarters in Baghdad, they don't want anything about the Umayyads. They eradicated. So the dignitaries are coming 5 to 6 years later. They're getting to China, and they're seeing this. The Chinese are seeing this, that there's something wrong, that they are now changing. They don't want to talk about the previous revolution. They're even acting differently. And they point this out, and they write it out. Here's another zeroing in on another aspect of what we now know is the changing between the Umayyads and the Abbasids happening in around 749, 750, though it's getting to the Chinese courts about 756, 758. I love that.
I would say that, you know, what it points out is the Abbasids were masters of propaganda, and they knew the power of a narrative, and that if you control the narrative, you control the politics on the ground. And that's, I think that's the key indicator there.
Okay. And then you talk about the Dashi, the ruling Dashi tribe, who are known as the Gulli, which could be very much the Qureshi. And then you talk about this Dashi. You then go into this incantation. I won't get too much into the incantation because people said this doesn't exist, and then you found it there in the Quran. But I love. Let's get back to this Qureshi. I love the fact that you're zeroing in on this, because the Qureshi is very clear from all your traditional sources. The Qureshi are the Hijazi people. Remember all the confrontation that during the time of Uthman, when Hudayfa comes down from the north, from Syria and Iraq, and he says, we don't like this dialect up here. We must write it in the Qureshi dialect. And so for what goes in our minds is the Qureshi is Muhammad's dialect. It's the dialect of Medina and Mecca. It's the dialect of the Hijaz. It's the dialect of Uthman. It's the dialect of Zayd ibn Thabit. That's the dialect. That's the Meccan dialect. That is that central part of Arabia dialect. That's what we've been told. And everybody thinks that. And then you're saying, hold on a minute, that word is there. But the Qureshi could actually be Cyrus. It could actually be Persian. This could actually be the Persian people, the Persian dialect, the Persian area. And where are the Persian people? Where is the Persian dialect? Well, look at it right up again. It's straight up where we've been telling you. It's right up there in the area of Iraq. And then you give a number of different references, people who have written it about this. They're saying that the Qureshi are the people of Cyrus. You give the Iraqi link again. A friend of mine who wrote in and said the same thing. And then you go to Alphonse Mingana, well-known name, again, a big name, like Fred Donner. Mingana is the one that got the collection for Birmingham University. And we're referring to Nasai, who's writing in 580, so much, much earlier. And he's talking about the Qadeshi. And you're saying the Qadeshi could be Qureshi, could be referring to that as early as that time. Am I getting you right on this? That you're talking about the 6th century, 5th to 6th century, they could have been talking about the Qadeshi there. And you could easily misinterpret D with R just by putting a dot above and below the letter.
Yeah.
So that's so you're finding reference after reference after reference that these Qurayshis, these Qadeshis, are people actually from Iraq. And that is not at all, Qurayshi has nothing to do with Mecca, has nothing to do with Yathrib, has nothing to do with Uthman, much, much further north. You get into another example, and you just give example after example, you come up with this engraving, this inscription, the Spa engraving, the JA 931. Written in 270. So now we're back into the 3rd century. As early as the 3rd century, you have 4 different people from Syria, Iraq, India, and these women from Quraysh. There it is, very clear. These are the Quraysh. Who are these people? Well, if you already have India, Iraq, and Syria, that's much further north. These women are part of that whole group. Then you can see that that would also possibly, you're not saying categorically, but possibly that could be from the Iraqi environment. And then I love the fact that you don't want to leave one stone unturned. And you can see there's this one guy who's been really getting on your case about Sabaeus. And it's nice that you did take him on, and also that you did answer his response. I don't know, to be fair, Mel, I don't know of any historian that does not trust Sabaeus, that Sabaeus lived in around 660. I don't know of any, I've never come across anybody that would say that Sabaeus is from, certainly not from the 8th century. And I don't know why this fellow keeps on harping on about this. I think it was good that you did go to, what's his name, Hoyland, and you let Hoyland support you. And I think that's good that you use experts in the field. I don't think anybody has done as good a job as Hoyland at looking at Islam from that time period, from the 7th and 8th century, and has, remember this, Dr. Robert Hoyland's region writes 18 languages. The fellow who's taking on, I'd like to know how many languages he's reading. I'd like to know if he is at the same caliber as Dr. Robert Hoyland. And it's good that you're using Hoyland, you're using Mingana, you're using Donner, you're using the big names, the heavyweights of the Middle Eastern community. And you're saying what Hoyland is saying is very clearly that Sabaeus is from the mid 7th century, but more than that, he can be trusted for a number of reasons. One is that he is current, that he talks about dates that things that are happening at that time, and he gets it correct. Mostly. You only give one example where he got it wrong, but I would even say that's not a great example that you gave between 615 and 625, because that's nothing more than telescoping two things together. That's called telescoping, or as you say, conflate. I would not say it's conflate, it's called telescoping. We do that all the time when we want to talk about many different battles. There's one battle, and he just gives out the date. And
simplifying the story, yeah.
It's not, he's not interested in the minutiae, he's interested in the whole big chapters of history. And we're all guilty of that, but most people just pass that off as nothing more than that. But you also say that he uses documentary material, and he talks about letters. These are real letters that are written between 614 to 631. And he also has access to privileged information that nobody could have had they been living later. Certainly not from the 8th century. They would have not known that specifically about why is it that while they were benign to other areas, why did they attack Jerusalem so specifically? And that's because of the young lads who were up there who were attacking the Persians. The Persians had to do a response. But no one else talks about that except Sabaeus. So I think you've got the right man at the right place doing the right thing at the right time. And thanks for doing that, because that helps the rest of us then to appreciate Sabaeus a little bit better and to realize this man is speaking in the right time period. He is at the right place. He is speaking about things that he knows about. He is referring to people that he's actually writing back and forth to. So that would make him and give him a lot more authority than say somebody 21st century says, no, I'd like to keep it in the 8th century.
I think the convention that he is Sabaeus is not significant. He's an anonymous author, but we can rely on him because of the early dating of his writings and the fact that he's using sources and eyewitnesses. So it doesn't actually matter if he actually was the historical Sabaeus or not. He's a good source.
I mean, Mel, we do this. I mean, think of Luke. We talk about Luke all the time, and the same thing has been brought against Luke, the author of the book of Acts and also of the Gospel of Luke. And people have said that he has got so many things wrong. And yet let me give you one example. In Acts chapter 18, verse 12, he says Gallio was a proconsul, and that was always attacked. Gallio was, there's no, everybody that knows about Gallio from the 1st century, Josephus refers to him, and there's no reference to him being a proconsul at all. So obviously Luke must be incorrect. And that's much like your writer is saying this, that you got the wrong man at the wrong place. He's much later, not that early. Well, that was until the Delphi inscription was uncovered. When they came across the Delphi inscription, here they found that Gallio was a proconsul in 52 AD. 52 AD, for only 1 year, which means
40%.
Which means whoever wrote Acts chapter 18, verse 12, which we know is Luke, had to have been living at that time and writing at that time and had to be privy to that knowledge. There's the privy again. He had to be privy to the knowledge that Gallio was a proconsul just for that 1 year, supporting the notion that the book of Acts had been written between 52 AD and 62 AD when he was finally killed. So that's why it's good that we have this kind of information, that we have people that are actually writing and they have privileged knowledge, much like Luke had privileged knowledge that we didn't know until the Delphi inscription was uncovered. So you can say that Sabaeus also had privileged knowledge, and Hoyland brings that out, and I think that's a good point.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, listen, we're going to be doing some more of this. This has been fun. Murad's coming on Friday. We're going to be looking at the Hijrah, and he's got some whole new evidence for the Hijrah. It's this, as you as we've said over and over again, the more we scratch, the more we find. The more we find, the more we shine. The more we shine, the more they whine, oh, how sublime. We're going to continue to scratch. Mel's going to continue to scratch. He's going to continue to look at artifacts. He's going to be looking at letters. He's been looking at inscriptions. This is the kind of thing that we're looking at because we're always going back to the 7th century. We're always going back to that part of the world and that time and with those people and those names. We're not going to get caught up in the 9th and 10th century. Let's stick to the 7th century. Have you noticed everything that Mel has been doing is coming from that period or before, even as early as 270. He's gone back to the 3rd century to support his case. Come back. Tell us if you don't like it. Tell us, but be sure that when you tell us what you don't like, that you support what you're saying, like Mel has been doing. He's been supporting everything he's saying. God bless you, Mel. I'm really glad what you're doing. You're doing us a great favor, and you're actually doing what every historian should do, and that is you're keeping your discussion within the time period of the people who we're talking about. It's been great doing that with you, Mel. I don't know if you want to say one last thing before we go, but go ahead.
It's been a pleasure to share that information with you and to respond to the viewers, and look forward to reading everyone's comments afterwards.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on.
This is Mel in Europe. This is Jay here in America. Over and out.